after leaked audio revealed that the second highest ranking Democrat in the House, Steny Hoyer, was trying to bully a progressive out of a race in Colorado, well, an article popped up in the New York Times defending Steny Hoyer titled, "Actually, National Democrats should interfere in primaries." Now, let's take a moment to just let that stupidity sink in. This is an individual who is advocating that a party who insists that it remains neutral during primaries should actually be able to cheat. Now, this argument in and of itself is problematic. I mean, it was published in the New York Times, a publication that has a very wide reach. And that's not the only reason why it's problematic. This was published by Elaine Camargue, who's actually a member of the DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee. She also happens to be one of the few members of the DNC that happen to argue in favor of keeping superdelegates. So that adds an extra layer of craziness to this story. Not only is this argument being made, but who is making this argument is a story and a scandal really in and of itself. This is a member of the DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee admitting that the establishment should be able to rig primaries. The party is getting really shameless in the way that they are spitting in the eyes of progressives, but nonetheless, let's hear her out. She argues the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee has come under fire for interfering in a handful of Democratic primary races around the country and trying to clear the primary field for the more moderate candidate they think will be the strongest in the general election. Party leaders have drawn the anger of some progressive Democrats who think that the mere attempt to do so is corrupt and undemocratic. I beg to differ. No other political parties and democracies in the world have abdicated their leadership role as much as America's have, weakening themselves and their ability to govern in the process. Party leaders have essentially given away the most important power they have to determine who can run and win under the party's banner. This power now rests exclusively with primary voters. This is not to say that there is no role for primaries, but the pendulum between the party's leaders choosing its candidates and primary voters choosing them has swung so far in the direction of voters that even the smallest, most modest efforts to intervene in nomination races are deemed illegitimate. Now, I just want to take a moment and pause right here. She's saying all of this as if it's a bad thing. Oh, well, when they try to intervene, people look at that as, illegitimate. Yeah, of course we do. That's not democracy. They're literally undermining the will of voters, and you're saying that it's preposterous that we view them as illegitimate when they do that, when they undermine the will of voters and overthrow a democratic choice? Really? You're okay with that? I mean, her argument boggles my mind. How can you make this argument with a straight face? She's basically advocating for a system like Iran where they have mullahs who dictate who should run and shouldn't run. That's what she thinks the status quo in the Democratic Party should have the power to do. Unbelievable. So we'll get to why her argument is not only really illogical, but also intellectually dishonest, but I want to finish what she says here because I think it's telling. Democratic leaders have intervened in, by my count, 14 primary races, suggesting, usually gently, that someone run for a different race or clear the field for a stronger candidate. Is this legitimate? My answer is an unqualified yes. That's what party leadership is all about. Are party leaders always right? Of course not. But they are different from the activists who often dominate the party primaries because they are more concerned with electability than with ideological purity. Party leaders have the job of winning nationally. Democrats are painfully aware that not all congressional districts are Berkeley, California. Left-wing Democrats frequently argue about the need to mobilize the base as a reason to run progressive candidates, but the strongest part of the Democratic base consists of African Americans, and among the districts the committee has intervened in, only 2 have an African American population percentage that is in the double digits. The average is only about 7%. The Hispanic population in many of these swing districts is larger, as high as 42%, and Democrats may be counting on them to vote Democratic in response to President Trump's immigration policies. In those districts, the name of the game will be to turn out the Democratic base, but also to move some white voters into the Democratic column. If ever there was a year for Democrats to pull this off, 2018 is it, as the special special elections of moderates in Virginia, Alabama, and Pennsylvania have shown progressive Democrats could find themselves celebrating in November if they let the party leaders do their job. You mean we'll be celebrating if we let party leaders do their job in rigged primaries in the same way that we allowed them to do their job over the last 8 years when they lost more than 1,000 seats in legislatures across the country? Really? Do you hear what you're saying, Elaine? It's preposterous. Her argument is intellectually dishonest, and it makes no sense, really. So her core argument here is that Democratic primary voters care more about ideological purity, whereas Democratic Party leaders, they're more focused on electability. But I have multiple responses to that. She's wrong for a number of reasons. First, if you care about electability, going with moderates has proven to be a disaster for the Democratic Party. And you don't have to go very far back in history to see that that was the case. Second, if you rig primaries, you're just going to piss off voters and demoralize the base. Do I really have to explain to you why rigging primaries and undermining the will of voters is not a very smart electoral strategy? I can't believe that I have to even explain this. Third, she cites electoral victories of moderates as evidence that party leaders are actually right to push for moderates. But first of all, she's not even taken into consideration Trump backlash, which will most likely make all types of Democrats more electable. And also, one of the 3 Democrats that were elected, she forgot to mention that it was Doug Jones who won marginally against someone who was a pedophile. And he barely won. He barely beat the pedophile. So to suggest that the only way Democrats can win is to go with moderates is absurd. And she's saying that really, if we just let them rig primaries for moderates, then we'd be celebrating because Democrats would gain power in the House. And they'd do what? She doesn't tell us what would happen if a bunch of moderates did come to power. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, Elaine, that Democrats got a supermajority. A bunch of moderate Democrats got a supermajority. Let's just go even further with this. Let's say that they won the presidency, they won the House, they won the Senate, they could do anything they wanted to do. Would they actually enact progressive policies that would benefit us? We saw how Obama, he wouldn't even push for a public option when they were debating the Affordable Care Act. He wouldn't. And we got a right-wing policy. So this is why we're pushing for progressives, because when we actually do elect Democrats, they only take baby steps to get us towards where we need to be. And really what happens is Republicans fuck up the country. They take us backwards, and Democrats aren't responding adequately to undo the damage that Republicans cause, which is why we're no longer relying on moderates. So why would we trust them? Why should we trust what Democratic Party leaders want after they failed us time and again? Now, fourth, I disagree with her, because if you run progressives, you might actually encourage the Democratic Party's core base, which is left-wingers, not moderates, to come out and vote for the party again. Stop courting moderates and Republicans when you can't even excite your own base. That's what the Democratic Party really has to acknowledge. If you can't even win over your own base, your core constituents, how are you going to get moderate Republicans to your side? It's just absurd to me. They are so mindless. They have no strategy whatsoever. They just basically say, we're right, you're wrong, accept it. Now, she actually does address this point that I'm making. She says, left-wing Democrats frequently argue about the need to mobilize the base as a reason to run progressive candidates, but the strongest part of the Democratic base consists of African Americans, and among the districts the committee has intervened in, only 2 have an African American population percentage that is above, or that is in the double digits. So she's correct to point out that progressive policies are popular among African Americans, because that's true, but really she's making the opposite argument that Joy Reid makes. Because what does Joy Ann Reid say? She states that we can't go with progressive policies because that only resonates with white voters, when the Democratic Party's core base is with black voters. But what Elaine is arguing here is that, well, since there's not a lot of African American voters in this particular district, well, there's no way for the Democratic Party to excite the base with progressive policies because there's just not enough people to come out and vote for these Democrats who are super progressive. So she's saying basically that progressive policies will only resonate with African American voters. Joy Reid says it'll only resonate with white voters, when really they're both wrong. It will resonate with everyone because, again, look at internal polling. when you go issue by issue, progressive policies are incredibly popular among the Democratic Party's base. And her underlying implication here that white voters won't come out to support progressive candidates and that they'll only support moderates, it's just simply not true. She provides absolutely no statistics or evidence to back up her claim. She just pulled it out of her ass and acted as if it was a fact when it's not. So this article, strategically speaking, she's giving Democrats the worst advice ever. I shouldn't have to explain why rigging primaries and interfering in primaries is a bad strategy. You're going to piss off your base. You're going to not just demoralize them, but you're going to drive them away. You're going to drive them to third parties. So it's not smart. Now, she's also being dishonest, as I alluded to earlier, because she states in the article that when the DCCC interferes in elections, they usually only suggest, quote, usually gently, that someone run for a different office or clear the field for a stronger candidate. But she's lying by omission. She's not detailing the full scope of interference. She's not talking about the really disgusting ways the DCCC and the Democratic Party establishment and state Democratic parties try to rig primaries against progressives. She doesn't talk about how they try to cripple their campaigns by cutting off their access to NGP van. She doesn't talk about how they covertly wage smear campaigns against progressives. She actually does reference that, to be fair, with regard to Laura Moser, but she doesn't talk about how widespread this issue is. And furthermore, she doesn't talk about how it's just immoral for them to do this when they're claiming to be neutral. So they're lying to us, and she's saying that it's okay if they lie to us. When it comes to her argument that American political parties don't have as much power as parties do in other democracies, this is such a disingenuous point to make. She basically performed mental jujitsu and tried to legitimize her argument by hiding behind academia and political science, but she's not telling you the full story about political parties and how there's real differences between open and closed political parties. We don't live in a parliamentary system like the United Kingdom where parties field candidates exclusively, and basically you can only vote for a party. You have no say as to who they nominate to leadership positions. That's not the type of system we live in. We live in an open party presidential system where we directly elect presidents and lawmakers independently. And as a result, party leaders shouldn't be able to bias the results in their favor or flip elections in the event they don't go their way. Political parties in the US are decentralized in part because we live in a federal system. So it doesn't make sense to say that national Democrats should be able to call the shots over 50 unique state parties. But even just ignoring her cherry picking of political science, I just have to go back to the underlying premise. She's arguing that restricting voter choice is a good thing. She's arguing that the status quo, the Democratic Party establishment, should be able to undermine the will of voters. And the examples that she cites to prove her point are of the 2010 Tea Party wave. She states that, maybe Republicans would have been able to take back the House and the Senate if they rigged primaries against members of the Tea Party. Maybe they would have been able to stop Donald Trump if they had superdelegates. She doesn't say this, but it's implied in the article. So, she's basically arguing here that party leaders should be able to change the results of elections if they don't like them. You're arguing that a party that has democracy in their name should be able to undermine democracy. Shame on you. There's nothing else to say. It's embarrassing. The fact that you are on the DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee and you hold these types of undemocratic views is terrifying. The Democratic Party should distance themselves from you because this is absolutely despicable.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.